Hi everyone, it's Alex with the PCRI. Today I'm interviewing my friend Howard Wolinsky. He's a prostate cancer legend in my opinion because he is an active surveillance patient who went on active surveillance when it wasn't really an option and wasn't popular. Today we're going to hear Howard's story of how he fought through the American medical system in order to have active surveillance as a choice and his journey on staying of active surveillance. He has some fantastic advice for us. You can go ahead and pick up his book, Contain and Eliminate, and it's basically an expose on the American medical system. I think you'll find all this educational, and I hope you have a good time watching this. So you've been this, I've been 10 years in the game of prostate cancer. I started pretty young, but your name has been there the entire time since I started my career. And being an influencer is a pretty incredible thing in prostate, but you started out as a journalist. So, you got prostate cancer along the way. So how did you go from journalist to prostate cancer patient to patient advocate? Obviously, I don't think that's something you planned out.
It's not something I planned out. It's actually the exact opposite of anything that I ever thought I would ever do. As a journalist, I can take on a cause, but I traditionally would have tried to stay away from anything personal. And in this case, I've sort of combined my journalism experience. I mainly was a medical reporter with personal experience. And it was my personal experience that turned me into an advocate. And that started in the summer of 2010. Being a dutiful patient, I had a PSA test without thinking about it. As a journalist, I knew about the prostate and had written about prostate cancer, but I never figured that would be me. So in the summer of 2010, my family doctor noticed that my PSA, which is used to diagnose prostate cancer, the level had gone up. And it had gone from about 3.2 to not quite 4. It was like 3.95. And he pushed the panic button. I was 63, or just about 63 at the time. And so he sent me off to see a urologist, a community urologist, a few minutes from my house outside of Chicago. And so I went. My wife, Judy, came along, and she's been with me for almost everything. And I'll give an example of that. We go to see this doctor, and he says, your PSA is getting up there. Why don't we do a biopsy? And so next thing I know, I dropped my drawers. I had on a gown. My wife was sitting there in a chair nearby as this guy did a biopsy. So when I talk about togetherness, this was togetherness. And so he sent this biopsy out, and what he got back was inconclusive. And he sent it to Johns Hopkins, to Dr. Epstein there, who offered a second opinion. He said that he didn't see any cancer. He saw some things that might be precursors to cancer. And he suggested that I be re-biopsied in 6 months. And so that's what I did. And this time they found a tiny speck.
Now, when you say biopsied, you weren't targeted biopsied, you were random needle biopsied. So you had 12 to 14 cores both times?
Yeah, these were the days before targeting was even discussed. It was, they were shooting darts in a barrel, and I was the barrel. And they took quadrants to kind of survey the prostate. And all they found was a single millimeter, or as they used to say in the cigarette commercials, a silly millimeter of cancer. And it was Gleason 6. Doctors today argue whether that's cancer or not. And it was in a single core. Technically, these are 12 to 14 individual needle biopsies. In my case, I had 14. So only one of them had the tiniest speck of cancer. And so I got called on a Friday night by this doctor's, who was hanging crepe. And he said, can you be in my office on Tuesday? And I took that, oh boy, this is going to be bad. But I'm a journalist, and I'd already done homework on what the possibilities were and had discovered there were some alternatives. So I go to this doctor's office, and he says, I have bad news and I have good news. First, the bad news, you have cancer. And he sighs. But so that's the bad news. I have good news. I have an opening in my operating room next Tuesday. I can cure your cancer. And I said, well, I've done my homework. I know there's this thing called active surveillance. And this is a way of, and I'm saying this to you, not to him, a way of monitoring the cancer with plenty of warning. I didn't actually realize how little, quote, cancer I had at the time. Meanwhile, I'm getting the rush into the OR. And I asked the doctor, is active surveillance a possibility? He's close by, it would be easy. He said, well, I don't support that modality. Then I asked him, do you do MRIs for this? Because MRI was just becoming available. No, we don't have that. So because I had planned it, I got a second opinion the next day from Dr. Scott Egner at the University of Chicago. And he looks at the recommendation of surgery. And he was very diplomatic. He said, well, that could help, but frankly, I don't think you need surgery. And he hands me some research by Dr. Lawrence Klotz at the University of Toronto. He said, if it was about active surveillance, if you go on active surveillance, you would be the poster boy. He said, I predict in 10 years, your cancer won't grow if you just go on active surveillance. But these were times, as you pointed out, where they were not doing targeting. They were kind of, we knew where I had, the cancer, and in subsequent biopsies, they tried to target around that area, but it wasn't targeted with an MRI. It was an MRI after they found the core with Gleason 6. I think from now on, I'm not going to call it cancer. I'm just going to call it Gleason 6, because I don't know that it's really cancer. It looks like cancer, but it doesn't act like cancer. So meanwhile, 10 years pass, and last year in December, I called Dr. Egner up, and I said, well, it's our anniversary. I had switched doctors for various reasons, but we've stayed in touch and have worked together on various things. And he said, I saved you from the surgery. I wish I could have saved you from all of the biopsies. Because back then, it was annual biopsies following a protocol at Johns Hopkins. And so I was, the compliant patient. And, I had the biopsies, although I know that they frightened some guys. And I know now that guidelines have changed. Like up in Canada with Dr. Klotz, there's like a 4 to 5 year interval. The doctor that I see now supported a 2-year interval. Although I was reading a study in New England Journal about 4 to 5 years ago from Dr. Carolyn Moore in London, looking at MRIs and using that to monitor. And he was resistant to that idea. But I think I've won him over. And in fact, most recently, he said, well, I think we're just going to monitor you with a type of PSA test, the PHI test, Prostate Health Index. I haven't seen him in 2 years. It's kind of hard to do digital rectal over the phone, but maybe that day is coming. But he's been pretty confident. I have kept up with the PHI test. But at any rate, so that I was angered by the fact that I came, this close push the words together to having surgery that I didn't need. Imagine this. I know 10 years, now 11 years afterwards, that nothing happened. Imagine if I'd had the surgery. For what? And back in those days, only 6% of us men with low-risk cancer, prostate cancer, or low-risk Gleason 6, only 6 to 10% of us went on active surveillance. And if you flip it the other way, that means 90 to 94% of us are, have surgery, radical surgery, bloody surgery, long surgery, and have a high risk of incontinence and impotence. And why? I can only imagine the damage that's been done. Well, I know the damage has been done to some guys who've been to the brink of suicide, and there undoubtedly have been suicides from this. I can't prove the numbers. I have the advantage of 11 years experience on active surveillance. And, I think back, I could have had that surgery, and what would it have been for?
But you think about it, you did things so differently because, even 11 years ago, for me to hear that not only did you know to get a second opinion, your doctor sent for a secondary pathology test, and you went to a different doctor, that thinking, unfortunately, is not common. I think it's more common now. We're seeing that starting to trend because more people like you are standing up and telling patients, and PCRI and a lot of other influencers out there. But to me, that's a very uncommon story for a decade ago.
It may have been the advantage of being a journalist. I had outstanding sources, especially in the city of Chicago. And I was lucky that in the city of Chicago, there were people who were doing active surveillance, like Dr. Egner and like Dr. Helfand. They're sort of the, I'd say the third generation of, I knew Dr. Chodak at the University of Chicago. He came up with some of these concepts, and it was Dr. Klotz in Toronto who came up with the term active surveillance. And now, younger doctors are on the bandwagon with this. It's not been easy. They've worked for a quarter of a century to get active surveillance recognized is the preferred method by the AUA, American Urological Association, and by the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Say that twice. I broke a story as a journalist back in September when NCCN tried to change that and said for low risk prostate cancer that it should be on a par with surgery and radiation. And they didn't say that for very low risk, which is the category I would fit in with. But they said it for low risk, and the patients exploded, and the support groups and the advocacy groups, for the first time that I know of, came out with statements saying that NCCN should reverse itself. And importantly, too, a lot of the doctors sounded off. And at the end of November, they reversed themselves. It's not been an easy fight. And I pointed out that maybe 6% of men like me went on active surveillance in 2010. Today, it's 55%. And most of that growth has been in the last 5 years. And 55% sounds like a lot, but flip it again, and that means 45% are being treated. And why are they being treated? Well, anxiety can be an issue, pressure from spouse and family who can't believe you can coexist with the cancer. Doctors who are shaky about letting patients go on active surveillance. Doctors not recommending active surveillance, not supporting it. I'd say, I don't know if it's true that there's a generational difference, but there is a difference amongst the doctors, and some are more supportive. I mean, I call this the rule of the tool. The urologists are trained to do surgery. Well, they do some medicine too, but they're trained to do surgery. So, it must be hard to resist doing surgery when, especially if you believe that it's going to help.
I think how Dr. Scholz puts it, he's like, well, if you're a carpenter and you're going to have a nail, you're going to hit that nail with that hammer, and that's it. That's what you're built to do.
It's exactly what I'm talking about. I call it the rule of the tool. So if you're the carpenter, you get the hammer, and if you're the surgeon, you have the surgery. So there's been a change. I mean, 55% is better than 6%, but it's a long way to go compared with, say, Sweden, where the national average for low risk is 94% go on active surveillance.
You know, Howard, your story is really inspirational because I think it's one of the catalysts that caused the sea change for active surveillance to really be propelled in the last 10 years. Because you were an influencer, you did write, you did speak up. I knew it wasn't like, from your story, it sounds like you really were like the reluctant patient in a sense of like the reluctant, medical patient journalist who came into the space because who really wants to speak up against an entire medical community? But even the story you just shared about the NCCN guidelines, I mean, that type of power of patients and advocacy groups speaking together and physicians joining together to create those types of changes is stuff that you've done and created the catalyst for and the foundation for a long time. I know I emailed you a couple weeks ago and I was calling you a legend. And it's true, because I'm sitting in active surveillance research meetings now that didn't exist. We didn't even have questions on like what would be the right research questions. And I know Mike Scott from, Prostate Cancer International worked a lot on that, but you did too. And so it's just really cool to see all of this. So based off of your story, what would you tell prostate cancer patients and like the best advice for active surveillance patients, whether they're low risk, intermediate, low risk? What would you tell them? Because I still think, like you said, we have a huge percentage of men who are getting diagnosed with Gleason 6 that are going straight to treatments that they don't need to. So what is the best method that you would tell an active surveillance or a low-risk prostate cancer patient looking to choose active surveillance?
I would say, in my opinion, get a second opinion. Get a second opinion on whatever strategy your doctor is recommending for you, if it's active surveillance or surgery or radiation therapy. Get a second opinion on that, but get a second opinion on your biopsy. And I've heard stories of doctors' offices that won't release the biopsy, even though the patient has every legal right to it. And I would say the same thing for MRI tests. MRI tests are hard to read, and it's hard to get good people in most of the country, I think, to read them. So you might want to get a second opinion for that. So in my opinion, get a second opinion.